Silas Vance hadn't spoken to a soul in 3 months, and he liked it that way. Up here in the high Sierras, the wind didn't ask questions, and the trees didn't care about the things he'd done during the war. He was 54 years old, with a face like a dried-up creek bed and hands that never quite stopped shaking unless he was holding a rifle. He had a small cabin, 20 head of cattle, and a dog named Blue who was as tired of the world as he was. But that morning, the mountain decided to break his silence. It was one of those late October days where the air tastes like iron and the sky is the color of a fresh bruise. Silas was out checking the north fence line when Blue started baying, a low, mournful sound that prickled the hair on the back of Silas's neck. He followed the dog toward a shallow ravine, expecting to find a downed calf or a mountain lion. Instead, he found her. She was face down in the frosted pine needles, half buried in a drift of early snow. Her coat was thin, city cloth, useless against the Sierra winter, and it was torn to ribbons. Silas knelt beside her, his joints popping like dry kindling. He rolled her over, and for a second, he thought he was looking at a ghost. Her skin was the color of skimmed milk, her lips a faint, terrifying shade of blue. She wasn't more than 21, maybe younger. "Easy now," Silas grunted, though he knew she couldn't hear him. He looked for a horse, a wagon, anything. There was nothing, just a single set of staggering footprints leading back into the treeline, already being erased by the falling snow. She had walked until her heart simply gave out. Silas didn't hesitate. He was a man who had spent his life surrounded by death, and he recognized the look of the soul that was halfway out the door. He scooped her up. She was lighter than a bundle of firewood, her bones brittle against his heavy coat. As he turned to carry her back to the cabin, her head fell against his shoulder, and she let out a single, jagged breath. "Don't," she whispered, her eyes remaining closed. "Please don't." Silas didn't answer. He just tightened his grip and started the long trek back to the only sanctuary for 30 miles. He didn't know then that by bringing her across his threshold, he was inviting a storm into his house that no fireplace could ever warm. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke and old coffee. Silas laid her on his own bed, the only bed, and set to work. He was used to doctoring horses and fixing broken equipment. But a human being was a different kind of fragile. He built the fire until the cast iron stove began to glow a dull, cherry red. He boiled water. He tore up clean sheets for bandages, though he couldn't see any blood yet. That was the strange part. She wasn't bleeding, but she was trembling so hard the bed frame rattled. He managed to get a few spoonfuls of warm broth into her before she finally opened her eyes. They were green, sharp and startling, like new grass pushing through ash. She looked at the rafters, then at the fire, and finally, she looked at him. The fear in those eyes wasn't the fear of a stranger. It was the fear of someone who knew exactly what kind of monsters lived in the dark. "You're at the Vance Ranch," Silas said, his voice sounding like gravel in his own ears. "You were freezing to death. I'm Silas." She didn't tell him her name. She just clutched the quilt to her chin, her knuckles white. Suddenly, the girl bolted upright. The quilt fell away, and she scrambled back toward the headboard, her eyes wide with sudden, frantic energy. "No!" she gasped. Her voice was raw, like she'd been screaming for days. "Please, no. Just let me keep them on. Please, Mr. Vance. I'll be fine. Just the blanket is enough." Silas paused. He looked at her boots. They were heavy, man-sized work boots, caked in frozen mud and salt. They looked like they'd been stolen from a much larger person. "Miss, I've seen frostbite turn a man's leg black in night," Silas said firmly. "I ain't gonna sit here and watch you rot because of some modesty. I'm an old man, and I've seen everything there is to see. Now give me your foot." "Please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. Tears started to track through the grime on her face. "Just let me keep my boots on. Don't make me. Please." Silas frowned. It wasn't modest. It was terrifying. He took a step closer, and she flinched so hard she hit the wall. Silas stopped. He knew that flinch. "I'm going to go make some coffee," Silas said quietly, backing away. "You sit there. Get your breath. But those boots are coming off one way or another." An hour passed. The sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows across the cabin floor. The girl had fallen into a fitful sleep, exhausted by her own panic. Silas sat at his small table, cleaning his Winchester. It was a rhythmic, soothing task. Slide the rod, oil the wood. He looked over at her. Her breathing was shallow. He noticed her right foot twitching in her sleep, a low groan escaping her lips every time it moved. He couldn't wait any longer. He moved silently. He reached the foot of the bed and carefully took hold of the right boot. She stirred but didn't wake. He began to unlace the frozen leather. It was slow going. The knots were tight, frozen solid by the Sierra ice. As the leather loosened, he felt a strange heat coming from the boot, not the heat of life, but the heat of infection. He slid the boot off, then the ragged wool sock. Silas froze. It wasn't frostbite. At least, not just frostbite. There, branded into the skin of her ankle, was a mark. It wasn't a ranch brand, and it wasn't an accidental scar. It was a series of jagged lines forming a broken circle with a lightning bolt through the center, the mark of the Red Jackals. Silas felt his stomach drop. The Jackals weren't just outlaws. They were a pack of wolves that had been terrorizing the territory for 3 years. They didn't just rob banks. They took people. They marked their property. This girl hadn't just been lost in the woods. She was a runaway. But that wasn't what made Silas's blood run cold. As he pulled the second boot off, he saw the other mark on her left calf. There was a fresh wound, a shallow graze from a bullet that had been poorly tended. It was red, angry, and weeping. But beneath the wound, hidden by the grime, was a tattoo. A small, faded bluebird. Silas gasped. He reached out, his trembling hand hovering over the ink. He knew that bird. He had drawn that bird on a piece of scrap paper 20 years ago for a daughter who had been taken from a stagecoach in a raid he was supposed to protect. "Sarah?" he whispered, his voice a ghost of a sound. The girl's eyes snapped open. She saw him holding her foot. She saw him looking at the mark, with a cry of pure animal terror. She kicked out, catching Silas in the chest and sending him stumbling back. She scrambled off the bed, huddling in the corner of the room, clutching a fire poker. "Stay away," she screamed. "I'll kill you. I swear to God, I'll kill you." "Sarah," Silas said, his hands held out, palms up. "Sarah, look at me. Look at my face." "My name is Rose," she yelled, her chest heaving. "And I ain't nobody's daughter. Not anymore. If you're still here, listening to the wind howl outside Silas Vance's cabin, I want you to take a second. Imagine holding the foot of a girl you thought was dead for 2 decades, only to find she's been branded like cattle by the worst men in the West. What would you do? Would you stay quiet, or would you reach for the shotgun? Before we find out what happens when the Red Jackals come knocking on that cabin door, and trust me, they're coming, do me a favor. If this story is hitting you in the heart, tap that like button. It helps these stories find the people who need to hear them. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join us here at the ranch. Out here, the stories are long, the coffee is hot, and we don't leave anyone behind. Now, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Is it morning where you are? Or are you sitting in the dark like Silas, waiting for the storm to break? Let's get back to it. Because Silas Vance just heard something that isn't the wind. Silas didn't move. He stayed on the floor, watching the girl. Rose, Sarah, whoever she had become. The firelight flickered in her eyes, showing him the wreckage of 20 years. She wasn't the little girl in the pigtails anymore. She was a survivor, hardened by things he didn't want to imagine. "The blue bird," Silas said softly. "I told you it was a swallow. I told you it meant you'd always find your way home." The poker in her hand wavered. "Just an inch." He told me he found me in the dirt," she whispered. "He told me my family didn't want a girl. He said the brand was my new family." "He lied," Silas said, his voice cracking. "I spent 5 years hunting for that stagecoach. I spent 10 more looking for men who took you. For a heartbeat." The silence in the cabin was so thick, you could hear the embers popping in the stove. Then, Blue let out a low, vibrating growl from the porch. The dog didn't growl at the wind. Silas was on his feet. In a second, the emotion was gone, replaced by the cold, hard instinct of a man who had survived the wilderness. He grabbed his Winchester from the table. "Get under the floorboards," Silas commanded. "No," Rose said, her voice turning cold. "If it's them, they'll smell the broth. They'll know. Sarah, get down there." "They call him the Skinner," she said, her eyes fixed on the door. "He doesn't leave until he gets what he came for, and he's been tracking me for 3 days." Silas looked at her. She wasn't shaking anymore. She was standing tall. Despite the pain in her feet, she picked up a heavy kitchen knife from the counter. "Then we stand together," Silas said. He moved to the window, pulling the heavy shutter back just a fraction of an inch. Out in the yard, silhouetted against the white snow, were 4 riders. They weren't hiding. They didn't feel the need to. They rode like they owned the mountain and everything on it. The man in the lead was wearing a coat made of different colored furs: coyote, wolf, bear. He had a long, thin face and a smile that looked like a scar. That was the Skinner. He stopped his horse 10 yards from the porch. "Vance!" the man called out. His voice was high and mocking. "I know you're in there, Silas. I remember you from the territory wars. You were always a man who liked to pick up things that didn't belong to him." Silas didn't answer. He checked the magazine of his rifle. 12 rounds. "I've got a girl of mine," the Skinner continued. "A little runaway. She's got a brand on her ankle that says she belongs to me. You give her back, and I might leave you enough fingers to play that fiddle I hear you like." Silas stepped out onto the porch. He didn't take a coat. He just took the Winchester. "This is my land," Silas said, his voice carrying to the cold air like a tolling bell. "And anyone on it is under my protection. You got 10 seconds to turn those horses around before I start making widows." The Skinner laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound. "You're an old man, Silas, and there's 4 of us." "Then it's a fair fight," Silas replied. The world exploded. Skinner's hand went for his holster, but Silas was faster. It wasn't the speed of youth. It was the economy of a man who didn't waste motion. The Winchester barked once, and the rider to Skinner's left tumbled out of the saddle, a hole where his heart used to be. Silas dove behind a heavy oak porch railing as a volley of lead tore through the wood, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. "Kill him," the Skinner screamed. "Burn the shack if you have to." Silas worked the lever. Crack slide. He popped up and fired again. Another rider's horse reared, throwing the man into the snow. Silas didn't wait. He fired at the man on the ground. 3 down, 2 to go, but the Skinner was smart. He'd slipped off his horse and was using the stone well house for cover. Bullets began to thud into the door, behind Silas. "Silas!" He heard her voice from inside. Then he heard the back window shatter. "Sarah!" he yelled, turning his head. One of the riders had circled around the back. Silas heard a scuffle, the sound of breaking glass, and a choked-off cry. He didn't think so. He ran back into the cabin, kicking the door open. A jackal had his arm around Rose's throat, a revolver pressed to her temple. He was a big man, smelling of unwashed wool and rot. "Drop it, old man," the outlaw hissed. "Drop it, or her brains decorate the wall." Silas slowed his breathing. He lowered the muzzle of the Winchester. "Easy now," Silas said. "You don't want to do this. I'll do whatever the hell I—" The man didn't finish. Rose didn't wait for Silas to save her. She drove the kitchen knife she'd been hiding in the folds of her skirt deep into the man's thigh. As he screamed and shifted his weight, she bit down on his hand. The outlaw barked in pain, his aim wavering for a fraction of a second. That was all Silas needed. He didn't use a rifle. He lunged forward, his large, callous hand grabbing the outlaw's gun arm and twisting it until the bone snapped. He threw the man against the stove. The outlaw's face hit the hot iron, and the smell of burning flesh filled the room. Silas grabbed Rose and pulled her behind the heavy kitchen table. "Stay down," he breathed. Outside, it went quiet, dead quiet. "Vance!" Skinner's voice was closer now, He was on the porch. You kill my boys. You're going to pay for that in skin, Silas. I'm going to take my time with you. Silas looked at Rose. She was covered in soot and blood, her hair wild. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of the daughter he'd lost. Do you trust me? Silas asked. She nodded. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was a stick of mining saltpeter he'd kept for clearing stumps. He'd rigged it with short fuse. When I say run, you run for the tree lean, Silas said. What about you? I'm right behind you. Silas lit the fuse on the stove. He waited until it was sparking white hot. Then he hurled it through the front door. Run! They dived to the shattered back window, just as the front of the cabin vanished in a roar of orange flame and splintering timber. The blast knocked him into the snow, the world turning into a blur of white and gray. Silas scrambled to his feet, his ears ringing through the smoke. He saw a figure crawling away from the porch. It was a Skinner. His fur coat was on fire, his face a mask of blood. He reached for a pistol in the snow. Silas walked toward him. He didn't run. He didn't yell. He just walked with the steady, inevitable pace of justice. Skinner looked up, his eyes wide with the realization that he'd finally met something more dangerous than himself. Wait, the Skinner wheezed. Wait, Silas, we can talk. Silas didn't talk. He raised a Winchester and pulled the trigger. The silence that followed was absolute. The cabin was a ruin. One side was scorched black, the roof sagging like a tired old man. But the fire hadn't spread. The snow had seen to that. Silas and Rose sat on the edge of the well house as the first light of dawn began to bleed over the mountains. Silas had bandaged her feet properly this time. The boots sat in the snow, discarded. What now? She asked. Her voice was quiet, but the terror was gone. Silas looked at the smoking remains of his home. He looked at the valley below. Now, Silas said, we go to the sheriff in town site. We tell them everything. We give them the names of the men who marked you, and then we rebuild. Rebuild? Rose looked at him. After everything, Silas reached out and took her hand. His was large and scarred. Hers was small and trembling. The West has a way of trying to burn us down, Silas said. But the thing about fire is it makes the ground fertile. Things grow back stronger. If you want to stay, this ranch has a name again. What's that? The Swallow's Rest, Silas said. She leaned her head on his shoulder. She didn't cry. She just watched the sun come up. Some people say the West was one with silver and lead. But if you ask me, it was one in the quiet moments. It was one when a man decided to look past a scar, or when a girl decided to trust a stranger. Silas and Sarah spent the next 10 years turning that charred cabin into the finest ranch in the high Sierras. They say Sarah Vance became the best horsebreaker in the territory. They say she never wore boots again without thinking of the man who forced them off to save her soul. What about you? Is there a mark you're hiding? Or a Silas you're waiting for? If this story meant something to you, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button before you head out into the cold. We got plenty more stories to tell, and the fire is always burning here. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and your hand on your heart. We'll see you on the next trail.